Hello and welcome to this video on social class, crime and justice. Official statistics show that working class people are more highly represented among offenders than those from other social classes. And there are a number of possible explanations for this pattern, and we as sociologists are interested in why this might be the case. The first possible explanation could be social deprivation. There is a link between the state of the economy and crime. Property crime in particular seems to rise when people are hard up. So at times in which the economy isn't doing so well, perhaps there's a lack of jobs and unemployment, perhaps there has been a squeeze on living standards, perhaps there's a lack of credit, and we can think about the recent financial recession in the UK from 2008 onwards as an example of this. We tend to find that people turn to property crime if they are struggling to make ends meet. So this might be one explanation for why we find more crime amongst the working classes in this area. A second possible explanation could be strain theory and the role of anime. Robert K. Merton, who we've looked at before, argued that deviance was a product of strain. So we as individuals are all under a strain between what we have been told by society we should seek to want to achieve versus our means to be able to achieve those things. And generally speaking, there isn't enough opportunities for everyone to be able to achieve all these things. So those living in deprived communities have poorer life chances. There is an unequal opportunity structure. So if you come from a more middle class family in a middle class area, there's simply more opportunities for you to achieve society's socially approved goals. This may result in individuals engaging in deviant adaptations to strain. So we all have to deal with the strain. Some of us will adapt in a way which is considered non-deviant, that is conforming to the rules and doing as you're told. Others will engage in deviant adaptations to strain, one of which could be to innovate. And the main way of doing that is, of course, to commit crime. So it could be property crime, stealing things, burglary and so on, in order to make ends meet, in order to try and meet the socially approved goals that society has socialised us into. A third possible explanation could be marginality and social exclusion. So, in the most deprived areas, there is likely to be high levels of marginalisation and social exclusion. To be marginalised is to be overlooked, to be ignored by policymakers and political leaders when they are deciding perhaps how to spend taxpayers' money and what social issues and ills they need to try and solve. Social exclusion is not being involved in the process of decision making. So we often find those from working class backgrounds are not involved in the process of, say, voting for those who are going to represent them both on a local and national level, and so they are effectively voiceless. In such communities, agencies of social control, such as the police, are likely to be less effective in socialising people into mainstream society. We can also think about education as playing a role or failing to play a role in this particular regard. Another explanation could be subcultural explanations, and here we're looking at the work of Albert Cohen, who we've covered previously. He argued that the working classes, particularly working class boys, suffer from status frustration. That is, they are given a status by society, in particular by those in power in society, the middle classes, and that status is undesirable, and so they become frustrated with it and their inability to change it. There's an inability for lower classes to achieve mainstream success goals via legitimate methods. So that would be getting the grades at school, getting the qualification, ultimately getting the job, and then providing for oneself in that socially approved manner. As a result of being forced into that low status, they rebel against the middle class status system, whether that be within education or society at large. And so we start to see things like innovation, deviant adaptations to strain. Thus, they may form or join delinquent or deviant subcultures. So within school, we're talking here about anti-school subcultures. Outside of school, we're thinking about criminal gangs. Within these, you're going to find that there are alternative status hierarchies, that is, different ways of gaining status. So traditionally, one gains status by working hard, earning money, owning property, and so on. Whereas within a delinquent or deviant subculture, you gain status by doing things which are everything from breaking the rules, perhaps even breaking the law, engaging in violence. And what you're seeing here is value inversion, taking the values of society, turning them on their head, turning them inside out, and doing the complete opposite in order to gain status. A fifth explanation for differences in terms of social class and crime could be to do with labelling, stereotyping and prejudice. The poorest sections of the working class are often referred to as the underclass. So this is this very 1980s Thatcherite type language describing this thin strata just underneath the working class of people who are considered to be not only perhaps earning very little, but probably not earning anything at all. That is, they don't have a job, they are systemically unemployed, they are relying upon the welfare state to provide for them, and they're described in this rather negative fashion, the underclass. The police hold stereotypes of the typical criminal, and if we were to look at what these stereotypes would be, they often describe effectively members of the underclass. We generally find that the police patrol working class or underclass areas rather than middle class areas. And so in that sense, they're far more likely to be there looking for people who fit these descriptions and are engaging in certain behaviours. And so they're picking them up, stopping and searching them. And so we see their numbers increase in the crime statistics. A fifth explanation could be informal social control. So working class youths are more likely to be prosecuted if they are caught, whereas middle class youths are often able to engage in what is known as the negotiation of justice when they are caught. And so actually middle class youths are instead being controlled in a more informal fashion than working class youths who are being controlled in a more formal fashion. What does this mean? Well, if we imagine a middle class young person perhaps being picked up and they've engaged in some sort of petty offence, when the police ultimately ring home and say, well, we have your son or daughter, they've done this, that or the other, the middle class parents turn up and they argue on behalf of their children saying, well, this is unlike them, they're working really hard in school, we don't want this to damage their job prospects, we'll punish them at home. And the police often go, okay, give them a caution and let them go, or even just simply verbally reprimand them. Whereas for working class youths, we tend to find that this doesn't happen. Instead, parents are far more likely to say, throw the book at them, we can't control them, maybe this will make them learn. And so as a result, they're far more likely to be not only cautioned, but perhaps even arrested, given a criminal record. And then from there, a whole range of potential issues come about, which may lead to even greater levels of crime and deviance amongst this particular group. A final explanation could be to do with the detectability of offences. So, the working classes tend to commit crimes which are more detectable or are more likely to be reported in the middle classes. So generally speaking, these crimes include things like property crime, so burglary, shoplifting, or more violent crimes, everything from assault and so on. Whereas the middle classes tend to engage in what is known as white collar or corporate or occupational crime, crimes which don't always have a clearly defined victim and which may be more difficult to detect. And so as a result, again, the police, when they're deciding how they're going to spend their time, often decide to go for easy offences to detect and ultimately to find the individuals and then ultimately bring them to justice. And that tends to be more working class crime. So thinking about the middle classes rather than the working classes, we need to consider white collar and occupational crime. White collar crime is a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of their occupation. Occupational crime is committed by employees simply for their own personal gain, often against the organisation for which they work, so for example, stealing from a company. Corporate crime is committed by employees for their organisation in pursuit of its goals, so for example, deliberately mis-selling products to increase company profits. So a range of very important definitions we need to be aware of there. We need to consider the scale and types of corporate crime. So it's estimated that white-collar crime in the USA costs over 10 times that of ordinary street crimes, which is something quite breathtaking to consider. So when we're thinking about all working-class crimes, and if you were to add up their cost and compare it to middle-class or white-collar crime and their cost, we tend to find that middle-class and white-collar crime is far higher in terms of its cost to society, and yet it's far less likely to be prosecuted. Toombs said in 2013 that corporate crime has enormous costs in terms of physical, environmental and economic impact, and that this is not a case of a few bad apples, but rather it's a widespread, routine and pervasive issue within our society that needs to be dealt with and is generally overlooked. Corporate crime covers a wide range of acts, including financial crime, such as tax evasion, so failing to pay your tax or finding clever ways to pay less tax, bribery, so giving money to people in positions of power to achieve some sort of end or to have your activities overlooked, money laundering, finding ways to clean the money that you've somehow acquired through ill-gotten gains. Victims include other companies, shareholders, taxpayers, and indeed governments. Crimes against consumers, everything from false labelling, so if a company is selling a product that has something written on the label which in fact it does not achieve or cannot do or isn't suitable for, this in a sense is a crime. Selling unfit goods, so if businesses sell goods which they know are faulty or which are going to break or which perhaps may even have some other problems, so may cause people to get ill, for example, all of this also is a crime. Crimes against employees, so that could include sexual and racial discrimination, violations of wage laws, of the right to join a trade union or take industrial action, and health and safety laws. It has been hypothesized, in particular by neo-Marxists, that health and safety laws are very regularly actually flaunted and broken, but they are very little enforced. That is to say, the police do not really spend much time trying to enforce health and safety laws, and so this may actually be a large proportion of white-collar and occupational or indeed corporate crime. Crimes against the environment, which we will consider in more detail when we look at transgressive criminality and green crime. And state corporate crime, so harms committed when government, institutions and businesses cooperate to pursue their goals. Another dimension of these types of crimes to consider is the abuse of trust. So high status professionals within our society occupy positions of trust and respectability. Caribbean et al. In 2014 argued that we entrust them with our finances, our health, our security, our personal information. However, their position and status give these individuals opportunity to abuse this trust for their own ends. A good example of this could have been Harold Shipman, a doctor who in 2000 was convicted of murdering 15 of their patients. And he did this essentially for his own personal gain, his own personal desire, something he was interested in. He was essentially understood to be engaging in psychopathy, but also he may have been gaining financially from this too. But the role of being an individual GP is a role of trust, and he abused that within society and amongst his patients. Crimes of this kind violate the trust that society placed in professionals. In Sutherland's view, this makes white-collar crime a greater threat to society than working-class street crime due to promoting cynicism and distrust of basic social institutions and undermines the fabric of society. So the concern here is if this abuse of trust continues or occurs on such a widespread level that it breaks down the bonds that tie us together. And in a sense, this could lead to a whole range of issues from anomie to anarchy in that functionalist sense. Another area to consider is the invisibility of corporate crime in this regard. So the media actually gives very little coverage of corporate crime, which reinforces the idea that crime is a working class issue. There is often a lack of political will to tackle corporate crime. Being tough on crime is focused on street crime. Governments often want to seek to be taking a zero tolerance approach, and the best way to do this is put bobbies on the beat, tackling street crime. But very little money, effort or attention is therefore being given to things like corporate or white collar or occupational crime, and so it goes under the radar, it continues to be invisible. The crimes of these kind are often complex. Law enforcers are often understaffed, under-resourced and lacking technical expertise to investigate these things effectively. Right now we have chronic underfunding of the police in the United Kingdom, and this might help to explain why the police tend to focus more on street crime or working class crime than middle class corporate crime. Also, it's underreported. Often the victim is society at large or the environment rather than an identifiable individual, or individuals may be unaware that they have been victimised, and as a result, the crime goes unreported, it does not appear on official statistics, and therefore often the police do not know that they should be pursuing these things as a result. Four main explanations are given for corporate, white-collar and middle-class crime. Firstly, once again, strain theory. When business conditions become more difficult and profitability is squeezed, companies may be tempted to break the law, that is, to innovate. Box argues that if a company can't achieve its goal of maximising profit by legal means, it may employ illegal ones instead. Pleinert and Jaeger found that law violations by large companies increase as their financial performance deteriorates, suggesting willingness to innovate to achieve goals. So we might be able to tie this to elements of Marxist theory, essentially saying that when the bourgeoisie feel that their profits are being squeezed, they may engage in crime and deviance, they may innovate in order to continue to protect that profit margin. Secondly, differential association. Sutherland sees crime as behaviour learned from others in a social context. The less we associate with people who hold attitudes favourable of the law, and the more we associate with those with criminal attitudes, the more likely we are to become deviant ourselves. If a company's culture justifies committing crimes to achieve corporate goals, employees will be socialised into this criminality. So this is saying that when employees enter into a business which has a kind of deviant work ethic, whilst that individual themselves may not be deviant or have a history of deviance, they may learn this deviance through their association now, and as a result begin to engage in deviant practices, which in fact are, of course, breaking the law. A third explanation may be labelling theory. Here Ziccarelli shows the middle classes are more able to negotiate non-criminal labels for their misbehaviour. Nelcon references delabelling or non-labelling, that businesses and professionals often have the power to avoid labelling. So here we need to understand that the labelling process is a power dynamic. There are those who label and those who are labelled. Those who label have power, those who are labelled do not. The middle classes have power in our society, or the corporate classes have power in our society. Therefore, they can either decide who to label or how to label their own activity, and may therefore negotiate the non-labelling of their behaviour as deviant or criminal. A final set of explanations could be Marxist explanations, which say that corporate crime is a result of the normal functioning of capitalism. We need to remember that Marxists would argue that capitalism is criminogenic, that is inherently criminal in the way it behaves, and so actually crime is normal in this regard. Capitalism has successfully created what Box calls a mystification. It spreads the ideology that corporate crime is less widespread or less harmful than working class crime. It's a story, it's a myth, it's a meta-narrative that's being fed to the people at large, claiming that actually when middle class crime occurs, it's very small scale, or it's very rare, it's a few bad apples, and it's not something to be worried about. Instead, we need to focus on working class crime. And this would be a myth that's being fed via the ideological state apparatus, according to Althusser, to the working classes to maintain the status quo. Some corporate crime is prosecuted, however, but it's only ever the tip of the iceberg. And what this does is it acts as a smokescreen. It's a way of holding up a few examples and saying, look, these people have been prosecuted, we've got it under control. But in reality, the bourgeoisie are getting away with large amounts of corporate crime, and it's invisible because they control the narrative. Box sees corporations as criminogenic because if legitimate means for profit are blocked, they will always resort to illegal techniques. That's it. Thank you very much.